Good morning, class. This is ECON 512, Introduction to International Trade class. Today is April 12th, Tuesday. The class will continue to discuss Chapter 11. Remember that Chapter 11 discusses the trade policy in developing countries. So here is today's discussion of the video clips. So the order of video clips are 1. The deindustrialization of India. 2. Trade and poverty in India. 3. Mexican garment industry. 4. Monopolistically competitive markets and trade policy. 5. Rationales for protectionism. 6. Does trade help the environment? 7. The cultural diversity critique of markets. 8. Green revolution. So here is the first video clip.
Comparative advantage is a powerful analytical tool, but when economists began testing it against real-world data, they found something interesting. Comparative advantage implied more specialization than we saw in the real world. Part of the problem is the large variety of products produced in a modern economy. But there is another issue that is important. Why do some countries import and export products that are in the same industry? For example, the U.S. both imports and exports automobiles with Canada. Comparative advantage says a country should either export or import. Clearly, we need a different model for some industries. The key is the degree of product differentiation within an industry. Another factor, industrial clusters, is discussed in the textbook but won't be reviewed here. Intra-industry trade is the phrase that describes an industry in which a country both exports and imports. Comparative advantage models are very good at analyzing inter-industry trade and specialization. However, they do not handle differentiated products very well. Markets whose main feature is product differentiation are called monopolistically competitive industries. The fundamental problem is defining an industry. If we define the industry as automobiles, then many countries both import and export in this industry. But if we define the market as high-performance automobiles made in Italy, we can be sure that Italy will be the only exporter of Ferraris, Maseratis, and Lamborghinis. Evidence suggests that intra-industry trade is greater in high-technology industries. One common driving force in monopolistic competition is internal economies of scale. The implication is that average cost falls over a relatively large range of output. Thus, expanding from a purely domestic market to a global market allows the firm to produce at lower cost and lower price. Now we are ready for the model of intra-industry trade. Note that the horizontal axis is not the quantity of output. Instead, we use the number of firms, and we assume total industry output is constant. An increase in the number of firms has two effects. First, increased competition puts downward pressure on prices. The P-line slopes downward to model this. Second, as the number of firms rises, output per firm falls. Therefore, average cost will rise as the number of firms rises. P1N1 is an equilibrium. At any price above P1, say P2, firms will be earning economic profits because price is greater than average cost. New firms will enter the industry, putting downward pressure on price and causing average cost to rise. Similarly, at any price below P1, say P3, firms will be earning economic losses because price is less than average cost. Some firms will exit the industry, causing price to rise and average cost to fall. Why do firms export? By increasing output, a firm can shift its average cost curve to AC star, lowering average cost and prices. Firms that are successful will have a competitive advantage. And if many firms go global, the number of firms will rise, average cost will fall, and price will fall. The new equilibrium will have more firms, lower prices, and lower costs.
So we've shown that there's gains from trade when you specialize in a good that you have a comparative advantage in. We've shown that there's a negative impact on consumer surplus if you limit trade, either with an import quota, import ban, voluntary export restraint, or a tariff, and yet we still see around the world protectionist policies. So what are the rationales for these protectionist policies? Well, there are several different reasons why a country might protect their domestic industries. One is to shield workers from foreign competition. It's one of the most basic arguments for protectionism, so that it keeps workers in an industry that would be hurt by free trade. Another is to nurture infant industries until they mature. Sometimes a country might want to help an industry mature and not force it to compete against a more mature industry in another country. And so there'll be some protectionist policies. And lastly, you might want to help domestic firms establish monopolies in world markets. If the production of a particular good requires extremely large economies of scale, the world market will support only a few, and perhaps just one firm. And so the domestic country might want to protect that.
Demonstrators in Seattle say that the World Trade Organization is a conspiracy that undermines the power of laborers to demand fair wages and good conditions, and that threatens the environment. Demonstrators in Washington, D.C. say that there is a global conspiracy on the part of corporations to co-opt the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization to become their own puppets, and therefore to hurt workers and the environment in their pursuit of profits. Is it true? Is the World Trade Organization a conspiracy? And how would you evaluate this claim? Well, let's first talk about international trade, which in some measure is inherently confrontational. That is, when a country lowers its tariffs and dismantles its quota and allows free trade in goods and services, customers in that country always benefit from access to imports because the imports themselves and the competition on domestic industries lowers prices. In the United States, when we someday get rid of our quotas on sugar imports and textile imports, all of us customers will be able to buy sugar and clothing at lower prices. On the other hand, the producers who compete with imports love the tariff and quota protection because it allows them to charge higher prices and make higher profits. And if you work for a factory that produces clothing and you've learned how to operate those machines and you've got your own human capital invested in that particular business, then you're happy for the tariffs and quotas that keep you from losing your job. So as consumers, we like free trade. As producers, we typically don't. There's this inherent conflict within a society about trade liberalization. On the whole, however, trade liberalization increases the market, allows more specialization according to comparative advantage, and overall increases the size of the pie. The world economy has grown so rapidly since World War II, largely due to its integration, the dismantling of tariff and quota barriers, free trade, and lowering in the cost of communication and transportation, which has made trade easier to do. Trade has increased the wealth of the world and has allowed a lot of countries to rise out of poverty, notably Japan, Korea. We could go on and on. However, the period of transition from being a closed economy with tariffs and quotas to being an open economy that has free flow of goods and services and competition, that can be a troublesome period for an economy and socially disruptive. So, what does the World Trade Organization have to do with any of this? The World Trade Organization was formed in January of 1995 as a successor to the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs. The General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, also called GATT, was a regular meeting of the countries of the world that saw that by cooperating and negotiating together, they could get everyone to lower their tariffs and quotas at once. That is, I'll lower mine if you lower yours, and therefore each country suffered a little bit, but not as much as if they'd try to do this unilaterally. There was cooperation to dismantle trade barriers. However, it was a regular meeting of countries without anybody to, on a regular basis, implement and enforce its agreements. It would be kind of as if Congress got together and made laws, but there was no executive branch, no president, no army, no police force to actually enforce the rules. So the World Trade Organization, as the successor to the GATT, is actually the first step towards the creation of some kind of international authority that can actually punish offenders and make sure that the agreements are implemented. So, of course, anytime you put a face on something, you now have someone to point at and blame for things. So when the World Trade Organization is created, it automatically is going to draw fire because now there's someone to blame for globalization and the adjustment costs associated with international trade. Well, what exactly is the World Trade Organization doing? The World Trade Organization has 4 sets of rules that it enforces of all of its members. If you're a country and you belong to the World Trade Organization, then you are expected to, first of all, accord national treatment to imported goods. That is, regulate goods that are imported into your country the same way that you regulate domestically produced goods, so that you don't show favoritism. The second thing you're expected to do is to accord most favored nation status to all of the other members of the World Trade Organization. That is, you charge them the same tariffs on imported goods that you charge everyone else. So within the World Trade Organization, you can't pick one country and give them favored access to your economy and another country and not. The third thing that you have to do as a member of the World Trade Organization is you have to eliminate quotas and other non-tariff barriers. That is, any barriers that don't operate as taxes on imports, that's what a tariff is, a tax on imports, but rather some other kind of restriction on trade, those have to be dismantled because trade barriers have to be rendered transparent, easy to see, easy to understand, and by the same logic, easy then to negotiate downwards over time. The fourth thing that you have to do as a member of the World Trade Organization is agree that your governments will not restrict their purchases to domestically produced goods. That is, the government of California, for instance, can't pass a rule saying that it's only going to buy goods produced in California, but rather that it's going to look for the best produced or the lowest prices from all competitors, foreign as well as domestic. So when California's Congress proposed a California-only purchase restriction a few years ago, the governor of California vetoed it as being inconsistent with the principles of the World Trade Organization, of which the United States and California are members. So those are the rules of the WTO. You can't have protection on goods and services that are not in the form of tariffs and that are applied unevenly from one country to another. Now, what all kinds of trade does the World Trade Organization seek to regulate? All trade in manufactured goods. They want to regulate trade in agricultural products, but that's more sensitive because there are some countries that subsidize their farmers and don't want to stop, although other countries view these subsidies as unfair advantages for the farmers. Services. The World Trade Organization increasingly seeks to regulate services, that is, trade in financial services, banking, insurance, telecommunications, computer services, and so forth. Also, intellectual property. The World Trade Organization wants to seek to have its members observe the patent restrictions of other countries. Developing countries don't like this. They don't want to have to observe patent restrictions. Rich countries are already way down the road toward economic prosperity. They'd like to catch up by being able to quickly copy and imitate the best practice technologies without having to pay money that they don't have to get patent rights. So the enforcement of intellectual property rules is something that works to the advantage of rich countries, in some cases to the detriment of poor countries. Although, of course, if those rights aren't enforced, then people will stop innovating and there won't be inventions for poorer countries to copy. So it's controversial and it's complex. Also, rules about the regulation of food quality. The sanitary and phytosanitary standards, the SPS agreement, covers food safety issues ranging from pesticide to hormone-treated beef and all this kind of stuff. And these rules are designed so that a country can't say, we're not going to import goods from your country because we don't think they are clean. As long as everyone agrees on what the standards are, then those rules can be applied evenly across the board. Now, what's the problem with the World Trade Organization? Why is it that protesters are out in the street calling it a demonic force? Well, first of all, there is concern that the World Trade Organization's rules prevent countries from being able to hold one another accountable for so-called fair trade practices. In particular, the concern is that some countries actually subsidize their domestic industries to make them more competitive internationally. That is, if the European farmers are subsidized by their governments, they're able to export their agricultural products at lower prices than, say, U.S. farmers or Canadian farmers can, and therefore their farmers have an unfair advantage in international competition. And the World Trade Organization says, well, then you can't block imports of European products because that would be discriminatory. And yet the U.S. and Canada might like to do that to punish those countries for their unfair subsidies of their farmers. So what happens then is countries lose the ability to punish other countries that are engaging in unfair trade practices. So whenever people in the United States claim that Japanese semiconductor factories were selling their products below cost, what they wanted to do then was to put a ban on imports of Japanese semiconductors into the United States. But the World Trade Organization would not permit that because that kind of ban would be counter to the kind of trade protection that it allows. Therefore, that kind of action will be rendered illegal. So if you're a member of the WTO, you no longer have the ability to use blocked trade as a tool to encourage another country to stop subsidizing or enabling its own industries to dump their products at low cost into your market and therefore create unfair competition for your domestic producers. So that's one controversy, that the WTO doesn't prohibit dumping. Now, in principle, it should. It should go to countries and say, look, we agree that this isn't a good policy, this is damaging industries in other countries. But once again, you see, we're getting here at the tension between producers and consumers, because as a consumer, I have nothing but thanks to any country that wants to subsidize its producers and let me get goods at lower prices. It's the domestic producers that have the problem with that, because they're the ones who have to compete with dumped, cheap goods. Another problem with the World Trade Organization is that it operates in secret. That is, the countries that send representatives to the WTO are scared to some extent that if they open their trade, if they liberalize their trade and open their markets without tariffs and quotas, their domestic producers are going to rise up and vote the government out of office or in some other way make their lives hard. So if you were a politician who was whose government was being represented at the World Trade Organization, you'd like for these negotiations to be held behind closed doors so that your domestic producers didn't get wind of the fact that they may be about to lose their quota protection. Well, this doesn't sit well with the protesters in Seattle and Washington who say, we want to know what's being talked about in there. It looks like a conspiracy. The doors are shut. We can't hear. There's no TV cameras in there. All this is being done in secret. If you have nothing to hide, then let us come in and watch. So the secrecy and the lack of transparency, of course, engenders suspicion, and therefore the countries are under scrutiny and criticism. On the other hand, the politicians argue, if you make us talk about this in the open, then we don't have the political will to stand up to these powerful special interests in our countries, and we can't do what's good in the long run for the economy if we have to bear the short-run political cost. So there's another problem with the whole thing. Are we going to have transparency or are we not? However, there's also a final concern, and this one is the most serious, and that is who's really going to benefit from the operations of the World Trade Organization. Is the liberalization of trade in the long run going to be most beneficial to consumers or most beneficial to businesses? Right now, multinational corporations and large businesses benefit from trade liberalization because they get to send their goods freely wherever people are willing to pay for them. Of course, the people who are paying lower prices in those countries get the benefit of good products at lower prices too. But there are also other costs of trade. I mean, think about this. In our own country, businesses pollute and damage the environment, and therefore we have a government that regulates pollution. Businesses are inclined to try to organize in ways that get them labor at the lowest cost. They want to bust up unions. They want to hire workers and put them in dangerous conditions at low wages. I mean, that's how you make a big return on capital. And government regulation, in many cases, allows unions to organize and gets workers in situations where they can work in safe conditions at a reasonable wage. And we don't have that kind of government regulation on the international level. That is, the world economy is, to a large extent, still completely unregulated. And therefore, pollution can occur as a result of international trade. Labor exploitation can occur as a result of the profit opportunities created by the world economy. And people blame that on the World Trade Organization. If we're going to have more trade, we're going to have more activity that goes beyond the power of the existing governments, and that's going to create the Wild West again. It's going to create a jungle in which all kinds of abuses can occur. However, an economist says, well, then, if what we need is some kind of governmental body, isn't the World Trade Organization trying to be that? And maybe this is where the protesters are onto something. Maybe what the protesters are saying is that it's not so much that the World Trade Organization needs to be abolished or that globalization couldn't occur, but it's just that we need the kind of transparency and accountability that we all expect from a good government if we're going to have international trade. That is, an economy that is truly global in scope needs some kind of government regulation that's truly global in scope. And there are all kinds of suspicions and prejudices about global government, too. So all that gets triggered by this. But the idea that the World Trade Organization is a conspiracy, it's kind of funny that the very people who are concerned often about protecting labor and protecting the environment are opposed to the first steps to create some kind of international authority that might actually do that very thing. And if you look at the records, corporations that operate in less developed countries are often have a much better record of protecting human rights in those countries and protecting the environment in those countries than do the governments of those countries themselves. So in some cases, one power, that is a corporation, may actually be better than the existing power, the corrupt government that's already there. It's complex, but the issue is, what are we really concerned about? Are we concerned then about the rights of workers, the environment, and the prospects for citizens in countries that are poor to get access to food, clothing, and other goods at low prices? If we are, then we should be in favor of organizations that exert their power to protect those interests. And perhaps the World Trade Organization could be such an organization if it were properly accountable and if it were properly transparent and participatory. I think this is what's happening right now, is the World Trade Organization is undergoing an adolescence. As the first step towards some kind of international regulatory authority, it's going to be subject to all kinds of questions and criticism and protest. And perhaps in the end, the protesters' voices will lead to the kind of accountability and participation that will make for an authority that can give us some kind of regulation to improve working conditions internationally, raise standards of living, and protect the environment. But it does require diligence, and it requires a willingness to participate, ask hard questions, expend ourselves, and to support the kinds of efforts that may be faltering and inadequate at first, but eventually turn into something really worthwhile. Consider the way in which government policy can influence trade. In particular, let's think about the government budget and the way in which budget deficits can influence the trade deficit. Let's start with the familiar equation that shows all of the uses of income and the equilibrium condition that spending equals income. Rearrange the letters and you get our familiar equation, savings equals investment. That is, all the savings in the economy can either be lent to businesses, lent to the government, or lent to foreigners. Now, let's consider the way in which the government budget deficit is related to the trade deficit. Suppose the government decides to run a bigger deficit, that is, increase government spending relative to taxes. If the government is going to run a bigger deficit, it's got to borrow more money. That means issuing more Treasury securities. The government is now competing for the scarce pool of savings, and it's going to be driving up the price of savings, that is, pushing up the interest rates. So one effect of the bigger budget deficit is going to be a higher interest rate. Now, this higher interest rate is going to have some consequences for international trade. The first is the direct consequence that foreigners want to lend us more money when our interest rate is high relative to the rest of the world. So foreign savings flows into our economy. That is, a capital account surplus. Now remember, from balance of payments accounting, the flip side of a capital account surplus is a current account deficit. That is, the thing that makes it possible for us to borrow money from foreigners is that we're going to start buying more from them than they're buying from us. That is a trade deficit. So the way we borrow money from foreigners is we start importing more stuff from them than they are buying of our exports. So the flip side of the government budget deficit is going to be a reduction in the trade surplus, or ultimately a growing trade deficit. That's the direct effect of the interest rate. The other thing that happens is the higher interest rate makes foreigners want to buy more of our stocks and bonds, increasing the demand for dollars. When the demand for dollars rises relative to the supply, the exchange rate is going to change. The U.S. dollar is going to appreciate with respect to foreign currencies. As the U.S. dollar appreciates, then what begins to happen is people in the United States find that buying goods from foreigners is a bargain. We start spending our stronger dollars on imports. Imports increase. Foreigners, meanwhile, find that it's unattractive to buy goods and services from the U.S. because the appreciation of the dollar makes our goods and services relatively expensive. So exports are reduced, imports are increased, and that gives us a bigger trade deficit. So two channels connecting the government budget deficit with the trade deficit. The first is the interest rate, and the second is the exchange rate. Now, let's consider then the way in which the government budget deficit and the trade deficit are related to the stocks of debt that stand behind them. Let's think first about the budget deficit. Each year's budget deficit is that year's addition to the national debt. Every year that we run a budget deficit, the government is issuing more government bonds to pay for that year's government excess of spending over revenue. The outstanding stock of government bonds is the national debt, which is about $5 trillion. Every year that the U.S. federal government runs a budget deficit, it's adding to the national debt, the outstanding stock of government bonds. Every year that the government runs a budget surplus, it can buy back some of that debt and reduce the outstanding national debt, reduce the outstanding stock of government bonds. Just as the budget deficit is each year's addition to the national debt, the trade deficit is each year's addition to our foreign debt. Before the 1970s and 1980s, the United States was the world's biggest creditor nation. We had lent lots and lots of money to foreign countries by running balance of payments surpluses, by running trade surpluses year after year. As we exported more than we imported, we were lending other people money. Then, after the 1980s, with the U.S. trade deficit occurring year after year at larger and larger levels, we started borrowing more and more money from abroad until the U.S. nowadays is the world's biggest debtor nation. Your foreign debt is the amount of corporate and government bonds from your country that are held by foreigners. And every year that you run a trade deficit, foreigners are lending you money. If you run a trade deficit year after year, you're going to be lent money by foreigners year after year until your foreign debt becomes larger and larger. So each year's trade deficit is that year's addition to the outstanding foreign debt, or the total amount of your country's debt or assets that are held by foreigners. So, as we add to the national debt, we're typically adding to the foreign debt, because the government budget deficit usually creates a trade deficit. The two deficits are like twins. If total savings and total business spending doesn't change, then the way we get extra savings in our economy when the government wants more is we suck it in from abroad. That is, we get foreigners to lend it to us. And the mechanisms that make that happen are changes in the interest rate and changes in the exchange rate. Take a look at some statistics from January of the year 2000. You can see that in that month, the United States ran a trade deficit with trading partners China, Japan, Canada, and Germany. You can also see that in the same month, the U.S. had trade surpluses with the Netherlands, Australia, Switzerland, Belgium, Egypt, and Turkey. Now, if you take all the countries with which we run trade deficits, add up the amounts of those deficits, and add up the amounts of the surpluses from the countries with which we have surpluses, you'll find that the U.S. has a big net deficit with the world as a whole. If you take all the countries in the world, the U.S., Canada, Mexico, and so forth, you'll find that the trade deficits and the trade surpluses, when added together, sum to zero. That is, for every country, for every dollar worth of trade surplus that a country has, some other country somewhere else has a trade deficit, because the sum of deficits and surpluses has to equal zero. Deficits are about countries that import more than they export, and the flip side is that capital is flowing into those countries as they borrow the money that allows them to run a trade deficit. Surpluses are about exporting more than you import, and those countries are lending money as they lend money to their trading partners, making it possible for the partners to buy more of their country's exports than the particular country is importing. So, trade and capital flows are intimately linked. A country that's running a trade deficit is borrowing money, and the sum of borrowings year after year adds up to that country's foreign debt. A country that is running a trade surplus becomes a creditor to the world, and over time, if it runs a surplus year after year, it becomes a net creditor, that is, a lender to the rest of the world. So trade and finance are linked in this way. We're here at the Laredo Bridge, an important link between the United States and Mexico, and a great place to think about the way in which these two economies are becoming more tightly integrated. The people crossing this bridge are mainly doing so for commercial reasons, to buy and sell things. And the easier it is to cross this border, the more likely they are to engage in this economic activity. Economic integration refers to changes in government policy that make it easier for people to do business across international boundaries. And an important aspect of economic integration is trade liberalization, the reduction of tariff rates, the elimination of quotas, changes that make it easier for people to buy and sell things across international boundaries. A good case study in the effects of economic integration has been looking at what's happened in the United States and Mexico following the enactment of the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA was implemented in January of 1994, and since that time, trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico has increased by 70%. Lots of jobs have been created. Factories have been built along the Mexican border, taking advantage of opportunities to ship goods duty-free to the U.S. New businesses have been started in the U.S. to send stuff to the Mexican market. Economic growth has followed economic integration, but it's not without its costs. Let's consider the ways in which NAFTA is changing lives on both sides of this border. Some critics claim that rapid economic growth is now damaging the environment, that the quality of the air and the quality of water along the border and in northern Mexico has been jeopardized by the rapid growth in new factories and new jobs. Others are concerned that the workers along the border are not being paid fairly or are being mistreated, the usual concerns about relations between labor and capital. And in general, there's the overall concern about the way in which our way of life is changing as we become more tightly integrated with our neighbor to the south. One big concern is traffic. Are our roads and bridges in the southern U.S. going to be able to handle all of these trucks bringing goods from NAFTA-inspired businesses northward? In general, though, NAFTA has been a huge boon for both the U.S. and for Mexico. Lots of jobs created, prices falling, prosperity expanding, and really the big beneficiary has been Mexico. Mexico's economy is only 5% the size of the U.S. That is, Mexico is economically smaller than Los Angeles. Therefore, the U.S. has kind of absorbed Mexico as if we just added another state. No huge change to our economy. Although some critics say that 200,000 jobs have been lost in the U.S. as a result of NAFTA, probably those people found employment in other industries, and industries that may not have existed without the opportunities created by this freer trade. Meanwhile, foreign investors from Asia, as well as investors in the United States, have put a lot of capital into northern Mexico, building factories, training workers, creating jobs. And exports from northern Mexico into the United States have increased by about 140% since NAFTA was enacted. These new jobs and new prosperity are undoubtedly leading to political stability in Mexico, which is a great thing for the United States to have along its southern border. Well, in general, economic growth brings with it certain concerns. Concerns about the environment, concerns about labor, concerns about changes in our way of life, and all of these ultimately become political questions. As the U.S. and Mexico become more and more tightly integrated economically, the next thing that becomes necessary is ever more political cooperation to resolve some of the environmental and labor problems, political problems that are going to crop up along the border as a result of this economic activity. NAFTA has definitely been good for business, but business isn't always a clear good for society. Sometimes rapid growth in business means changes that people have to cope with socially and politically. And NAFTA, like most other changes in business, has brought mixed blessings. Economic integration, changes in government policy that set in process economic growth. And economic growth requires social and political adjustments.
Whether trade promotes growth used to be a very controversial question. It's less so today, I think, in large part because of the development of better empirical evidence. And that's what we're going to look at now. Here's a graph we showed earlier which shows that GDP per capita in landlocked nations is much lower than in nations which have access to the coast. And indeed, if you take a look at the landlocked nations, among them are some of the poorest countries in the world, like Rwanda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. There's a few rich countries, Austria and so forth, but these tend to be the exceptions. Being landlocked is bad for growth. Now that's important because it tells us something about policy. Being landlocked is something like having high tariffs. It's a sort of a natural experiment in having high tariffs. Here's Henry George, a famous 19th century proponent of free trade. Echoing a statement I quoted earlier from Adam Smith, Henry George says, "If to prevent trade were to stimulate industry and promote prosperity, then the natural protection to home industry offered by rugged mountain chains, by burning deserts, or by seas too wide and tempestuous for the frail bark of the early mariner would have given us the first glimmerings of civilization and shown its most rapid growth. But, in fact, it is where trade could best be carried on that we find wealth first accumulating and civilization beginning. It is on accessible harbors, by navigable rivers, and much-traveled highways that we find cities arising and the arts and sciences developing." So Henry George is saying it's not places which have natural tariffs which have a lot of growth and wealth. It's places which have naturally low tariffs. So that tells us something about policy. Here, in fact, is a graph showing countries between 1965 and 2000, and they've been labeled according to their tariff barriers, their non-tariff barriers, interventions with the exchange rate, and other factors determining how open they are, policy factors. And what it shows is that average GDP per capita in countries which were always closed during this time is much lower than in countries which were always open. And indeed, the more open the countries, the higher was GDP per capita. So this is equivalent to our natural tariff barriers, our mountain ranges, also showing the same relationship with tariff barriers, with our policy choices. More open economies tend to have higher GDP per capita. Now, these kind of results have been questioned because they don't control for other factors. Maybe there's something different about open economies. And it's not due to trade, but due to something else, which makes them have high GDP per capita. So let's take another look at a different approach to this problem. Here from a paper by Vagzia and Welch is a graph showing growth rates before and after major changes in trade liberalization. These is taken over 50 years or so from many different countries over different time periods. And what you see is that after liberalization, you see a much higher growth rate, in fact 1.5 percentage points higher than before liberalization. Also notice, by the way, that liberalization is often preceded by a number of bad years. So crises is often what it takes to generate reform, but when you do get reform, you get a big increase in growth rates. That's really quite a stunning increase, a 1.5 percentage point increase in growth rates after major increases in liberalization is a really important change. James Fierer, another economist, has looked at the influence of trade through the use of a great natural experiment, the closing of the Suez Canal. So because of the Six-Day War between Israel and Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, Egypt very quickly closed the Suez Canal in 1967. It was closed for 8 years until 1975. And in fact, Egypt closed the canal down so quickly that 15 cargo ships were actually trapped within the canal for 8 years. Amazing. Now, the Suez Canal greatly reduced the distance between some pairs of countries, but had little or no effect on other pairs of countries who had access to either a trade route which is at least as good as the Suez Canal, or in fact which was better than the Suez Canal. So what Fierer does is he looks at what happens to trade and what happens to income in those countries, those pairs of countries, which were most affected by the closing down of the Suez Canal. So another way of thinking about this is that the closing of the Suez Canal was like an exogenous increase, like a random increase in tariff barriers. It was if you picked from a handful of countries and you said randomly, okay, you guys are going to have much larger tariff barriers for the next 8 years. Let's look at what happens in your countries. So it's a natural experiment in raising tariff barriers because increasing the distance which ships had to travel is really the same as raising those tariff barriers. So what Fierer finds, indeed, is that the closing of the Suez Canal had a big effect, reducing trade in some countries. And in those countries where it had the biggest effect, you also saw very significant decreases in income. So a very nice natural experiment showing that decreases in trade decrease income. Perhaps the most important piece of evidence which has convinced most economists that trade is good for developing countries comes from China and from India. So China was a terribly poor country in 1978, which is when they opened up to foreign trade. And the rest, as they say, is history. Since that time, China has been growing at about a rate of 10% per year. Absolutely unprecedented for about 30 years now. Totally revolutionizing China and the world. Now, a lot of other things, it is true, were going on in 1978. Mao was dead. They improved property rights, particularly in agriculture, and they began to free up their economy on many different margins. Nevertheless, it's clear that without trade, China would not have been able to grow nearly as much as it has. The story is also quite similar for India, beginning a little bit later in 1991 with the liberalization of trade. And again, after that, growing at a rate of about 6% per year. Tremendous, tremendous growth for a country which was just simply not used to growth at anywhere near that levels. What's also interesting is that China has traded goods, and India, speaking broadly, has traded services. So these countries, very different countries, one an authoritarian regime, the other basically a democracy in a developing country. Despite these differences, both these countries have managed to benefit tremendously from trade. And these countries are important because there's over 2.5 billion people or so between them. So only two examples, but very, very important examples of the power of trade. Recent empirical evidence has also taught us more about the sources of growth from trade. Surprisingly, it's not just from comparative advantage. So think about Portugal. In the comparative advantage theory, Portugal benefits from trade by specializing in wine production and by producing less cloth. But what we're finding is that countries which open up to trade, both their cloth industry and their wine industry become more efficient and more productive. So competition here is a spur to efficiency. That is, it pushes prices closer to marginal cost. But it also tells firms, you'd better keep up with the cutting edge. You'd better be productive. You cannot sit back and laze around and expect to have a market which can't be taken away from you. Because we now have international competition, every company has got to be on its toes. So what happens is that efficiency and productivity increase in both the cloth and the wine industry, and you get a shift from the less efficient producers, the less productive producers, to the more productive producers within the industry. Market size here is another important variable, because the larger the market is, the greater the incentive to invest in improving productivity and research and development. So if a country enters into a free trade agreement, it now has a much larger potential market for its exports. Those exporting firms have a much greater incentive to invest in new products and new ideas, in R&D, which is going to pay off with a much larger market. Investment also increases. I'm going to come back and talk more about that in a minute. And you get inflows of new knowledge. And I'm also going to talk more about this. So let's talk a little bit more about investment. Here again is Vagsia and Welch, this time looking at investment before liberalization, trade liberalization, and investment after liberalization. And what you can see is that there's a very large and marked increase in investment beginning with liberalization. Looks like a big permanent increase in investment. Now, there's a couple of reasons why this might be the case. It doesn't follow directly from comparative advantage, but it does follow with a couple of other assumptions. For example, as you enter into a free trade agreement, your exporters get a larger market to which to export. Therefore, it makes sense for them to invest in larger factories to build more productive capacity. That's one reason. Another, perhaps even more important reason, is that we have to think about free trade not simply in consumption goods, but also in investment goods. Free trade may be even more important in investment goods than in consumption goods. So what happens with free trade is that the price of investment goods falls. So with a lower price of investment goods, it now becomes cheaper to, import Caterpillar trucks, for example, or to import computer equipment, or to import new technologies. Okay, as those import prices of investment goods falls, the amount of investment increases, and as we know from the Solow model, that increases economic growth. Free trade also brings imports of knowledge, increases in knowledge. And this comes from some pretty obvious but pretty stunning ideas. So first of all, most growth is from ideas. It's true you can increase your capital stock, you can increase the quality of your labor. That's important. But overall, probably a majority of growth comes from increasing productivity, that is, from ideas. Now, here's the obvious but amazing fact. Most ideas come from other countries. So this is going to be true for most countries in the world. Okay, most countries in the world are simply too small to produce a lot of new ideas year after year after year. In fact, by one estimate, the innovations produced in just 3 countries, the United States, which is the dominant one, Germany, and Japan, these 3 countries account for more than 50% of the growth in most of the other countries in the world, estimated on the OECD countries. So more than 50% of the growth in Australia and Canada and France, Norway, Spain, the United Kingdom, and so forth, comes from ideas which were produced in the United States, Germany, and Japan. So there are massive spillovers in new ideas. Now, the thing about new ideas is they're not simply in the air. Often new ideas come embodied in imports and in people. Now, how do you get those ideas into your country then? Well, you import the goods. So when you import high technology goods, that's like importing new ideas. You get the benefit of those ideas in your country, and by importing the goods, you begin to learn about those ideas as well. Same thing with foreign direct investment. So one of the most important facts of foreign direct investment is not simply that you're bringing in money or capital, it's that you're bringing in people who bring in ideas. And it's in this way, through the import of goods and through the import of people, which new ideas diffuse throughout an economy and increase productivity in that economy. So eventually, what we want is everyone to be on the world cutting edge, everybody to benefit by ideas produced anywhere in the world. And we get there by increasing free trade. This tells us, by the way, that free trade is going to be especially important for small countries. The United States can go it alone. The United States is big enough so that it self-generates most of the ideas which it uses. But for most of the other countries in the world, they're too small to get the benefit of the ideas. They need and they want to import ideas from elsewhere in the world, and the way to do that is to have free trade, not just in ideas. It's not enough just to read the journals from other countries. You've got to import the goods, and that's how you get the ideas. Well, we've covered a lot today, and here are some further resources on geography, on trade liberalization and growth, on distance, the Suez Canal effect, and so forth. See you next time.
In India in 2012, there's been quite a bit of debate as to how much additional competition to allow from foreign retailers. Let's look at some of the economics of this issue. A lot of the debate has centered around Walmart, the American retailer, but also Carrefour, IKEA, and other foreign suppliers. Such companies already have the right to sell wholesale in India, and as of 2012 they received greater privileges to sell retail in India from the federal government, but the state-level government still can impose significant restrictions. Perhaps by the time you're hearing this video there have been further developments yet. Walmart has a motto which is always lower prices. The company doesn't literally always charge lower prices, but it takes advantage of high levels of productivity and high economies of scale, and it can be quite a fierce competitor. This is what's good about the company, but it's also part of what's unpopular about the company, namely that its competitors don't like having to compete with the lower prices. The main disadvantage of a greater Walmart presence in India would be that many Indian small merchants would be put out of business. This would also mean hardship for them. It would mean a higher level of unemployment and, in general, some amount of economic disruption. On the other side of the ledger are significant benefits. These include lower prices for customers and also higher and more regular payments for suppliers, including farmers. For instance, imagine that it's Walmart selling groceries. Well, that means Walmart will be buying more from Indian farmers. It's a mistake to think that the only beneficiaries of greater retail competition are foreign investors. A lot of the beneficiaries would be Indians, especially poorer Indians and Indians with limited incomes. Other benefits would be that larger and foreign firms are often more productive, and also, this is important, there are often productivity spillovers to Indian firms from watching Walmart, learning from Walmart, perhaps having employees who worked for Walmart and then take their knowledge back to the Indian firms. Walmart has been successful in Mexico, and this also has led to some broader productivity improvements in that country. These improvements include improved systems for trucking, which have benefited other companies and sectors also, development of centralized warehouses, greater standardized procedures for shipping and delivery, and also better practices of labor management. In all of these regards, Walmart has helped to upgrade some other parts of the Mexican economy. In this situation, when there's greater competition in retailing, economists tend to believe that the benefits from the greater competition will exceed the costs. One reason they believe this is called the theory of comparative advantage, and this is outlined in detail in 2 videos in our section on trade, and I will refer you to those. There is also what economists call the theory of public choice, and this says that even if there might exist some ideal government policy to restrict trade with foreign retailers, it's unlikely that a government will actually pursue that ideal policy. Instead, domestic governments tend to pursue policies which are too restrictive or give too much advantage to domestic businesses or special lobbies, or to pursue restrictive trade policies which are in some way too corrupt and in fact are not ideal or optimal. When you put together the theory of comparative advantage and also the theory of public choice, in general most economists favor greater allowance of retail competition, including from foreign investors. An interesting question is to ask how much will Walmart and indeed other foreign retailers actually dominate the Indian economy? The answer is not obvious. In a lot of other foreign markets, Walmart hasn't always dominated at all, and in some other countries it's had to leave because it wasn't profitable enough. The developing nation where Walmart probably has done best is Mexico, and that country as a developing nation is one which is relatively similar to the economy of the United States. Some particular problems which Walmart faces and will face in India include very complicated labor laws, including at the state level, a very tough-to-manage infrastructure, which make the speedy delivery practices of Walmart difficult to pull off, just in general very different consumer expectations, which maybe Walmart is not in the best position to understand, and also the reality that Walmart must deal with a higher level of corruption. Of course, to the extent that Walmart does not succeed in India, both the costs and benefits of Walmart market entry would be lower. There's plenty to read on this topic. For one very short introduction, see in India Inc. the article, Can Walmart Build a Nation? For a more academic treatment of foreign direct investment, you might read this piece, which is available online. Also use Google, trying the keywords offered in this section, and for the very latest news, type those keywords into news.google.com. Let's take a look at corn markets in Malawi as a classic example of failed policy. Malawi is a landlocked country in Central Africa, and it's one of the very poorest nations in the world, with a per capita income of only about $800. Maize, or corn, is extremely important to the economy of Malawi. It accounts for 60% of their growing land, and more importantly, corn accounts for about 70% of the calories consumed. So if there's a bad corn harvest, it means some very serious problems for food supply in Malawi. The price of corn in Malawi is at its lowest during harvest time, which is basically April through June, and here you see the price being quite low, and the price of corn is at its highest at around February, which is right before the harvest, and that gap is about 60%. So the price of corn within a year in Malawi is extremely volatile. Ideally, what one would like is to have more trade of corn, so when the price of corn is high, corn supply comes in from other countries or perhaps from stored inventories, and that this graph is smoothed out somewhat. But that's not the case, and thus there is a risk, and especially high risk, of corn hardship in Malawi in those months when the corn prices are higher. In Malawi, only about 15% of the corn supply is traded. For the most part, it is grown by farmers and then consumed, but markets and institutions for trade are relatively weak in Malawi. In recent times, there have been some corn price spikes in Malawi, due mostly to a restricted supply and bad harvests. The policy response to these corn price spikes, for the most part, has been counterproductive. For instance, the Malawian government has instituted price controls on corn, but when the government artificially holds down the price of corn, there's then much less of an incentive to bring corn to market, and in the longer run there's less of an incentive to grow corn for the next time around. The Malawi government has also at times placed export bans on corn. The rationale here is to prevent corn from leaving the country, and maybe in the short run this means more corn in the country, but again we need to consider the medium and long-term response, and that is when farmers know they cannot export corn in difficult times, they are less likely to grow corn in the first place. What makes even less sense are import bans on corn. The Malawian government has done those too. And finally, the Malawian government at times has gone so far as to try to shut down trading in corn altogether. Again, simple economics will tell you this will make a corn supply crisis much worse rather than better. Fortunately, to some extent, there are black markets in Malawi, and trade in corn has continued even when governments have tried to shut it down. The overall result of these policies is that plentiful corn in Malawi has been harder to come by. There's a very good paper by Ellis and Manda, and they outline what is a common cycle of events for corn markets and corn policy in Malawi. It's a pretty depressing story, but let's just run through it. Starting at the beginning, we see that very often prices fall at harvest time less than average. That means there's going to be a less good than average corn crop during the harvest. That also means that after the harvest, prices rise by an especially large degree because corn is especially scarce. The government doesn't recognize that there's a problem, but typically what they do is they officially declare that there's a fully supplied market so that the government looks good. Later on, it turns out that corn prices were higher than the government had wanted them to be, and the government comes along and it accuses traders of hoarding corn and blames the problem on the traders. The government also attacks speculators or maybe institutes legal penalties against them. Of course, what speculators are doing is trying to allocate corn to those points in time when the price of corn is highest, which means the demand for corn is highest, so speculators even out corn price movements over time, but commonly they're attacked by governments for being a major source of the problem. State marketing bodies then intervene and buy up a lot of the supply of corn. That makes corn even more scarce on the market, and then government in Malawi makes a further mistake by trying to ban private trade in corn. That's just about every economic policy mistake imaginable in that quick sequence. But we're not done. Let's continue. The government may then reinstate a monopoly of state marketing bodies on the grounds that there's some kind of crisis in the corn market, but the state marketing bodies don't do a good job of supplying more corn. It's then the case that the government will have rationing. There will be sales from dwindling public stocks, which are handed out and using coupons and other legal means rather than letting markets allocate the corn. During all this time, there's a demand for greater imports, typically from neighboring African nations, and after a delay of months, some of those imports finally arrive, or they are at least ordered, but the imports on average arrive late. That's because Malawi has bad procurement policies, and also because the infrastructure and transportation are very bad, and sometimes by the time the imports have arrived, they arrive at exactly the same point in time when the next harvest is coming along, which is when the imports are needed least, and that makes the price of corn for a while especially low. But one thing Malawi could do to have better corn policy is simply make it easier for imports to arrive more quickly rather than banning and taxing and trying to limit imports through the force of law. That's all a mouthful, but basically it is a story of hunger, and it is a story of hunger because of bad and misguided policies. These are not policies which are defended by any serious economists, but they're a good example of how, around the world, government policies toward agriculture are often quite irrational. The analysis of this video has drawn on an excellent paper by Frank Ellis and Elizabeth Manda, Seasonal Food Crises and Policy Responses, a narrative account of 3 food security crises in Malawi, available online. One of the countries that's improved its agricultural policy the most has been Bangladesh. During the early 1970s, the situation in Bangladesh was quite grim. Many people starved to death, a lot of the population was extremely vulnerable, and the country was heavily dependent on food aid from outside. At the same time, Bangladesh had some of the worst agricultural policies in the world. They had price controls, they restricted imports, and the government controlled a good deal of both fertilizer and irrigation. The Bangladesh Agricultural Development Corporation was responsible for importing and wholesaling virtually all of the agricultural inputs. In general, market price signals were not allowed to operate, there wasn't much scope for entrepreneurship, and most important agricultural decisions were politicized. Starting in the 1980s, there were a series of reforms stretching over about 15 years, which moved Bangladesh from having some of the worst agricultural policies in the world to having some of the best. Perhaps most importantly, it became quite easy to import foodstuffs from abroad. So if there were people who needed food, it was then possible to get that food through trade. Markets within the country were liberalized, price controls were removed, and government gave up most of its control over the fertilizer market and also to well irrigation. Over the course of about 10 years, the use of fertilizer tripled once the government essentially privatized fertilizer markets. The government continued its role in research and development for agriculture, flood control, and also infrastructure, but overall Bangladesh moved to having the freest and least subsidized agricultural markets in all of South Asia. The reforms have been quite a success. The production of food in Bangladesh went up, the production of rice went up, and there was rapid downward pressure on the price of rice due to competition and market incentives. The country is now essentially self-sufficient in rice and in fact has become a significant agricultural exporter. Earlier, in the 1990s, it was necessary on some occasions to import food from abroad, and this proved possible, and it happened through markets, often trading with India. These imports staved off what might have been potential famines. The reforms also improved the fiscal position of the Bangladeshi government, and now when food aid is given, that aid is actually more likely to be targeted to the very poor. Finally, following the reforms, Bangladesh made impressive progress on the United Nations Human Development Index, in part because it was feeding its people much better. To read more on this very interesting and successful episode, I recommend these sources. The dwindling of manufacturing in India was part and parcel of the process of Indian economic decline. In the first half of the 18th century, India was a global manufacturing powerhouse. Indian textiles were worn around the world, they were worn around Asia, they were exported to Europe, they were worn by American slaves, and they were sent to Africa. Indian agriculture had high productivity, and Indian textile manufacture had relatively high productivity, of course both by the global standards of the time. The subsequent decline was striking. In 1750, it is estimated that India accounted for about a quarter of the world's manufacturing output. By 1800, this had gone down to 1/5. By 1880, India was accounting for less than 3% of the world's manufacturing output. What were the causes of this decline? One major economic problem for India during this time was drought. Prior to 1775, it was relatively wet weather for India. The chance of a drought in a given year was less than 1 in 5. After 1775, the chance of a drought in a given year rose to 40%. Agriculture was such a major part of the Indian economy that if a drought came and the harvests were bad, very few other things went well in India. Another major economic problem for India was the collapse of Mughal rule, culminating in the early 18th century. Historians have debated just how much this mattered for Indian economic prosperity. The traditional view was that the collapse of Mughal rule led to quite a bit of disorder in India, it led to higher trade barriers, it led to foreign invasions, and in general India was less of a single coherent economic unit. There have been subsequent revisionist accounts which suggest the collapse of Mughal rule was not in every way a total disaster, but still a balanced perspective seems to suggest that the collapse of Mughal rule really did bring some serious economic problems for India. If one looks at data on grain wages, they start to decline in the late 17th century, and this decline continues throughout most of the 18th century. The problems became much worse in the early 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution of Britain, the rising productivity of the British textile industry, and, combined with that, the British takeover of India. All of a sudden, British textile mills were more productive and offered a cheaper product. To make matters worse, parts of the world, such as much of Latin America, the United States, Australia, Canada, and New England, all put stiff tariffs on foreign textiles, including textiles from India. British rule forced free trade on India, that is, the Indians had to accept British textiles with no tariffs. Now, in general, economists are strong believers in free trade and the benefits of international exchange, but this particular episode of free trade doesn't seem to have worked out all that well. For one thing, India did not have free trade to export its textiles, but perhaps more importantly, the Indian economy was seeing significant disruptions because of the cheaper British textiles, and there were too many barriers to trade, there was too much corruption, there was not enough infrastructure or resource mobility for free trade between India and Britain to lead to a reallocation of Indian labor to sectors where it would be more productive. So it wasn't really a free trade at all. It was free in one particular way, and it certainly wasn't a fair trade. What happened is that a lot of Indian textile workers lost their jobs and were unable to find lucrative employment somewhere else. The rate of deindustrialization starts to slow down by the 1860s, and by the late 19th century, early 20th century, India is very much reindustrializing. This is in part due to better technologies, better education for some workers, and in general, India is now competing as a low-wage supplier of textiles, whereas Great Britain, the United States, and other locations have much higher wages. Over time, in the 20th century, India built up a significant and diversified manufacturing base, especially after independence. A great deal has been written on the deindustrialization of India. You can simply Google India deindustrialization, and you'll find many sources. The single source that I have found most helpful, and I think most accurate, is the one listed here.